gratitude that he said he worked with me for his session.
Friends, a bit about the Anuradha Gandhi Memorial Committee, which was formed in Mumbai in 2008 by friends of Anuradha soon after her untimely death. An annual memorial lecture was instituted in her memory to celebrate the spirit that made her selflessly adopt the cause of the wretched of the earth. With unwavering dedication to her memory, the committee has hosted 7 Anuradha Gandhi Memorial lectures in Mumbai. Some of the distinguished speakers have been Samir Amin in 2008, Jon Myrdal in 2009, Baburam Bhattarai in 2011, Arundhati Roy in 2012, Harry Vanden in 2013, Uma Chakravarti in 2014, and Meena Kandasamy in 2015. Friends, on behalf of the Anuradha Gandhi Memorial Committee, I am indeed delighted to welcome Dr. Angela Davis to deliver the 8th Anuradha Gandhi Memorial Lecture this evening. We are indeed very happy and grateful to you for accepting our invitation. We are thankful to Chandra Talpade Mohanty, a very important scholar and activist, also based in the United States, to have made Angela's trip to Mumbai possible. Welcome Gina Dent, who for a long time has closely collaborated with Angela on many significant projects. Just 2 days ago, both Angela and Gina talked to the students and faculty in TIS campus. Also, I have the pleasure in welcoming various left and Dalit movement activists who are present here in large numbers. Lastly, but not the least, with all our respect and regards, we welcome Sunil Shanbag, Anuradha's brother, his wife, Anuradha's sister-in-law, Rita Shanbag, and we're sorry to say that Anuradha's mother, Kumud Shanbag, couldn't join us today due to ill health. The committee is happy to have a panel of eminent scholars and political activists to participate in the discussion and raise certain provocative questions to Angela after her lecture. May I request Angela to please come up to the stage. Chandra Talpade Mohanty, Mr. Kumar Ketkar, Bernard DeMello, and we have amongst us Mr. J.V. Pawar, whom I would request to please come up to the stage. Dr. Angela, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. J.V. Pawar, who is one of the co-founders of the Dalit Panther movement. Chandra Talpade Mohanty is a professor at the Syracuse University in the United States. She also heads the Women's Studies Department. And she, with Gina and Angela, have been doing a lot of work in the United States and internationally. Bernard DeMello is the associate editor of the Economic and Political Weekly. And Mr. Kumar Ketkar needs no introduction. Welcome you all to this panel. On behalf of the Anuradha Gandhi Memorial Committee, I'm also delighted to welcome you all to this meeting in such large numbers. Thank you. After Angela's lecture, we will present a summary in Hindi too. Thereafter, the session will be open to questions from the House. There is just one request, that first the panel would be raising certain provocative questions to Angela, after which the questions from you would be taken up. But please, during the time of Angela's lecture, please write down your questions. We will only accept questions in the written form first, and that would be then presented to Angela by one of our committee members on the panel. Now I would move on to talk about Anuradha Gandhi. But Anuradha was different, in quotes. That is what everyone who knew Anuradha says, writes Arundhati Roy in a foreword to Anuradha's book, Scripting the Change. For a bit of information, this book is now available to buy in the stand which has been put up outside in the foyer. So you could probably, after the talk, the lecture, go over and buy them there. Anuradha died in 2008 of malaria that she picked up in the jungles of Jharkhand, where she had been conducting teaching classes to groups of Adivasi women. It was too late when she got to the hospital in Mumbai. She was just 54 years old when she breathed her last. She was a committed revolutionary. A student activist in Mumbai in the 70s, a student in Elphinstone College then, founding member of progressive youth movement known as Proyom popularly then, a lecturer in Wilson College, founding member of CPDR. In 1982, she shifted to Nagpur in order to work with the poorest of the poor, working in construction sites and coal mines in Nagpur, Chandrapur, Amravati, Jabalpur, and Yavatmal areas. This led to deepening of her understanding of the Dalit movement. She worked relentlessly to strengthen and expand the extraordinary women's movement, perhaps the biggest feminist organization in India, the Krantikari Adivasi Mahila Sanghatan. Having then more than 90,000 active members, she worked till her demise with the CPI Maoist movement. Anuradha wrote, and I quote, "The history of the caste system can be tracked back to over 3,000 years. It is inextricably linked to the development of class society, the emergence of the state, the development of the feudal mode of production, and the continuous but often forcible assimilation of tribal groups into exploitative agrarian economy. To root out the caste system, we must first understand its origin and development and evaluate the successes and failures of the various struggles against the caste system and Brahminical ideology." Unquote. Anuradha was committed to breaking the shackles of feudal patriarchy and build the new democratic revolution. In spite of her activist role, she wrote extensively with similar vigor. She was a serious scholar. Her writings are rooted on injustices that she saw around her. She was a Marxist-Leninist and not simply a liberal activist. Her writings on gender and Dalit issues, many of them put together in a book, Scripting the Change, are important readings. She believed that without dismantling patriarchy and caste system, there could be no democratic revolution. I conclude by quoting again from Arundhati Roy's writing, and I quote, "In her writings on caste and gender, Anuradha Gandhi shows us a mind and an attitude that is unafraid of nuance, unafraid of engaging with dogma, unafraid of telling it like it is to her comrades, as well as to the system that she fought against all her life. What a woman she was," unquote. At this point, I would request her brother, Sunil Shanbag, to come up and say a few words.
As a theatre person, when I see a hall this full, I'm immediately tempted to do a quick performance, because you don't get to see that. But I know that we're all waiting very, very eagerly to hear Dr. Angela Davis deliver her lecture, and we've been reading about quotations from her earlier talk at TISS, and we're eagerly to, want to hear what she has to say. So I'll very quickly use this occasion first to thank you very much, Dr. Angel Davis, for coming here for this wonderful gesture of solidarity. A formal acknowledgement really cannot express how honored we are to have you here. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank very much the Anuradha Ghandy Memorial Committee that, as you heard PK just say, over the years has been putting together this wonderful series of lectures and a fine, list of public intellectuals, not just from India but from abroad, have sort of graced the occasions and delivered some amazing lectures. Thank you very much for that. Also to older comrades, younger colleagues who have worked over the last 1 month to create beautiful artworks, to communicate to all of you, the information and the news about this lecture, which is why you probably have turned up in such large numbers. Thank you very much for that. Just one thought. While coming in, we saw all these beautiful paintings outside, the photographs, the video loops, the little films, and you're going to see one more now. Also Rossi's wonderful rendition of Pete Seeger's song. And it kind of reminds me about the strong connect there used to be between the world of art and politics. Perhaps I'm talking about the late 70s and 80s. And I'm just so delighted to see that it seems to be happening again. There is an openness to that because we all know how powerful the arts can be in communicating with people, in really delivering a very nuanced view of all that we believe in. So I'm just hoping that this is the beginning and we can find that reconnect again and take this work forward. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The Anuradha Memorial Committee has been a voluntary engagement by her friends, and we do spend a lot of money in organizing such events. So may I please appeal to all of you to contribute generously to the committee. There would be Susan Abraham, who would be standing outside making sure that the doors are secured before you get out, to please contribute. She'll be holding a bag into which you could drop in your contributions, and she and my other friends of the committee would be able to also give you receipts for your contributions. May I now invite, before Angela starts with her lecture, Mr. J.V. Pawar to honor Angela Davis by giving books that he has written on the Dalit movement and that have been translated into English. Mr. Pawar, please. Angela.
First of all, I will welcome Dr. Angela Davis on behalf of the workers of Dalits of Mumbai City. The Dalit Panther movement was started in the year 1972, and in 1973, when I heard about the Black Panthers movement, in 1970, on 8th January 1973, I got my first daughter, whose name I kept after Angela. My daughter's name is Angela. And that is in the year 1973. Till 1973, because you have started your struggle before 1972, I know, 66, 67, and I have started the struggle in the year 1972, but I was so much impressed about your struggle, so I was very eagerly waiting when I will meet you or I will welcome you. Today is the day when I am getting the chance to welcome you on behalf of Mumbai. On this occasion, I will give some of the books. Of course, my books are in Marathi. Ketkan Saab knows my books are in Marathi. I don't write in English. But some of the books have been translated in English. Only that 3 books I am giving. I am presenting her today. And of course, Marathi books which are on Dalit Panther subject. If she able to know in Marathi or she get translated from somebody else. That also I will give. I brought all the new books here, but I don't think she will be able to understand or she will be able to get translated from Southern. Dr. Sridhar Pawar had told me that he'll get it translated and then he will send to Dr. Angela. Anyway, thank you. I am giving this book. This book is on eve of 125 years of Dr. Ambedkar's birth century. Then this is after Ambedkar movement, after Dr. Ambedkar movement. This part 1, 5 volumes are published so far in Marathi. Out of that, one is in English that I am giving him. And this is the collection of poetry, Nakebandi, blockade. You know the blockade. So this blockade in our life, there is a collection of book that I am giving to Dr. Angela ji. I will request her to accept this.
First of all, let me say how honored I am to have been invited to deliver the memorial lecture, which pays tribute to Anuradha Gandhi almost 9 years after her untimely death on April 12, 2008. I am grateful for this opportunity to visit Mumbai, and I'd like to thank the members of the Memorial Committee, P.K. Das, and all of the members of the Anuradha Gandhi Memorial Lecture Committee. And I also thank my friend Chandra Talpati Mohanty for allowing me to imagine this visit many, many years before it finally materialized. And finally, I thank Dr. Elena Sen, whom I met 5 years ago in Delhi when her husband, Binayak Sen, was still in prison. Since I've been here during this trip, I have met a number of political prisoners. And I am reminded of the era which was depicted on film. And I have to say that I find it really difficult to watch myself on the screen, especially so many, many years ago. But since I have arrived, a number of people have approached me to tell me about their involvement here in Mumbai in the campaign for my freedom. Is it possible to keep the lights up?
No, keep the lights on.
Yes, yes. I would actually like to see the people whom I'm addressing. Thank you very much. And I'm reminded of that era, which was such a difficult era, with Richard Nixon as the President of the United States. And I mention it very specifically because of the new political circumstances that have evolved in the US. And perhaps I'll allude to those circumstances before my talk is over. But let me say how grateful I am for the opportunity to examine and reflect on the life and work of Anuradha Gandhi, whose capacity to link scholarship, pedagogy, and radical on-the-ground activism was exemplary. Over the last few days of my visit to Mumbai, I have encountered a number of people who have spoken about the profound influence Anuradha Gandhi had on their lives, either as a person with whom they were directly connected or as a great influence with respect to her ideas and all of her various activisms, and of course also with respect to the way she chose to live her life. And I'd like to refer also, as did P.K. Das, to the illuminating foreword by Arundhati Roy to the collection of writings entitled Scripting the Change. I learned from that foreword that despite a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, Anuradha Gandhi worked with the People's Liberation Guerrilla Army for a number of years in the early 90s, living in the Dandakaranya forest in Bastar. There she worked in support of what Arundhati Roy called, and I'm quoting, perhaps the biggest feminist organization in the country, the Kantikari Adivasi Mahila Sangatan, and excuse me if my pronunciation isn't correct, I'm trying, that has more than 90,000 members. Anuradha Gandhi realized how important it was to develop deep relationships with communities that were and remain subjugated and oppressed in India. And what I find absolutely extraordinary about her interactions with Adivasi and Dalit communities is her apparent awareness of the deeply problematic approach that often prevents many well-meaning people from entering into egalitarian relationships with marginalized groups. In other words, she seems to have been intensely aware that if one brings an assumed superiority into the relationship, as is unfortunately so often the case with those who see themselves as missionaries or providers of charity, it is possible to replicate and consolidate social hierarchies even as one thinks one is dismantling them. This is a pervasive problem with respect to racism, and probably with respect to, oh, people can't hear? You can't hear?
Can.
You can't? Okay. I was just informed that you couldn't hear, so let's see. Perhaps this will be a bit better. And I was saying that this is a pervasive problem, both with respect to racism and casteism. Moreover, my impression is that she learned as much or more from the Dalit and Adivasi communities with which she worked as she herself was able to teach. During this era, when we are experiencing the dislocations created by global capitalism and what we might call the enlivened vestiges of colonialism and the relentless ideological influences of neoliberalism that are nurtured by such forces as Islamophobia, racism, casteism, xenophobia, we are in need more than ever of Anuradha Gandhi's inspiration. Therefore, I decided to broadly organize my remarks around the topic Black Lives, Dalit Lives, Histories and Solidarities. Because I would like to think about and try to link the collective predicament of Black people in the US and Dalit people in India. And to do this is not to assume that race and class are fundamentally the same. It is not to assume that the one can be reduced to or explained by the other. At the same time, it can be argued that there are many insights to be gleaned by thinking together about two different peoples and two different modes of subjugation. In order to subvert the assumption that those in the global South are forever placed in a position of having to learn from those in the global North. And that even the oppressed in the South have more to learn from the oppressed in the North. I'm interested in how we in the United States can learn from the long history of struggles of the Dalit people in India. And so I'd like to look at the moments of contact, a number of moments of contact, however brief they may have been, between these two histories. These moments of contact, it seems to me, remain promises that allow us to imagine stronger ties of solidarity in the future. In the aftermath of the constitutional abolition of slavery in the United States, here in the state of Maharashtra, Jyotiba Phule dedicated his 1873 book, Gulamgiri. Correct pronunciation? Okay. He dedicated this book to anti-slavery activists in the United States. And when Phule called upon the lower caste and the Dalits to unite to defeat the caste system, he was making a connection with people struggling against the enslavement of Black people. And this was one of those moments of promise, a promise of solidarity, a promise we need to hold on to as we imagine and attempt to build solidarity in the present. Of course, many people have pointed out that when Dr. B.R. Ambedkar studied at Columbia University in New York, he was certainly aware of Black movements. Columbia is located on the edge of, actually Columbia is in Harlem, although it is often represented as being located on the edge of Harlem, that is to say, not really in Harlem. But of course, at that time, Harlem had long been considered the capital of Black America. Moreover, Ambedkar's contemporary, W.E.B. Du Bois, through his scholarly and activist work, repeatedly points to the pivotal importance of India to the fate of people of African descent all over the world. And it's interesting that in the papers of W.E.B. Du Bois, which are in an archive which is housed at the University of Massachusetts, there is a note that is included, a note written by Dr. Ambedkar, who contacted Du Bois in the 1940s to ask about the National Negro Congress petition to the United Nations. And Ambedkar explained that he had been, quote, and I'm quoting, a student of the Negro problem. And he said, there is so much similarity between the position of the untouchables in India and of the position of the Negroes in America, that the study of the latter is not only natural, but necessary. In July of 1946, Du Bois wrote back, and I have to say that I'm nostalgic about those days when we actually wrote letters. But he wrote back responding that he was aware of the work that Dr. Ambedkar was doing and that he, quote, had every sympathy with the untouchables of India. But many Black people in the US may have only encountered Dalit struggles through Dr. Martin Luther King, who drew a direct connection between race and caste. And I'd like to read a rather long passage from a document written by Dr. King in 1959. It is entitled, "My Trip to the Land of Gandhi." And there is even here the problem of segregation. We call it race in America, he wrote. They call it caste in India. In both places, it means that some are considered inferior, treated as though they deserve less. We were surprised and delighted to see that India has made greater progress in the fight against caste untouchability than we have made here in our own country against race segregation. Both nations have federal laws against discrimination, but after this has been said, we must recognize that there are great differences between what India has done and what we have done on a problem that is very similar. The leaders of India have placed their moral power behind the law. From the prime minister down to the village councilman, everybody declares publicly that untouchability is wrong. This was in 1959. But in the United States, some of our highest officials declined to render a moral judgment on segregation. And some from the South publicly boast of their determination to maintain segregation. This would be unthinkable in India. Well, I've read this rather long passage from King's papers because I think it allows us not only to understand his profound misreading of the situation at that time in India, but it also reveals the limits of the law and thus the limits of an exclusively civil rights strategy with respect to ending both casteism and racism. In other words, had King examined casteism within a less reductive framework, he might have assumed that he might not have assumed that the only path toward ending casteism consisted of changes in the law. Just as the Black freedom movement in the US at that time had begun to move along a trajectory defined precisely by the limits of the law. In other words, prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it might have been possible to develop a more complex approach to ending racism, particularly given the failure of constitutional changes in India to end casteism. Of course, King's ideas transformed as the movement matured, and indeed at the end of his life, the strategies had shifted from an exclusively civil rights strategies to labor movements and poor people's economic power. When Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, he was in Memphis, Tennessee, interestingly enough, in support of Black sanitation workers. He was there to participate in a strike that was being conducted by Black sanitation workers. And I say interestingly enough, precisely because sanitation work is the hereditary occupation of the Dalits. So that's a very interesting conjuncture. There's another moment of contact between Black Americans and Dalit people with the founding of the Dalit Panther Party in 1972, am I right? 1972. Some 6 years after the creation of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. Now, some have argued that there has been a tendency to imitate ways in which Black people in the US have engaged in struggle in other parts of the world. But I would rather like to think about the fact that the socio-historical location of people of African descent within the heart of the political economy of capitalism at the site of European colonization in North America, that this has led necessarily to a strong focus on the struggles of Black people in the US, precisely because Black freedom struggles have continued unabated, relatively unabated, for more than 4 centuries, and especially given the international solidarity offered to those who fought against slavery, who fought against lynching, against segregation, etc. Because of this, US anti-racist struggles have always resonated throughout the rest of the world. And so it is thus not surprising that Dalits would identify with the revolutionary militancy of the Black Panther Party in the US and create their own Dalit Panther Party. But it's also interesting that the Panthers in the US, in acknowledging the connection with Dalits in India, also engaged in a kind of misreading, reducing Dalits to Black Indians, as if that is the only way the connection becomes legible. And so I focused on these various misreadings and reductionist understandings of the relationship between Black struggles in the US and Dalit struggles in India in order to highlight what I see as radically different approaches that have emerged from feminist formations, both in the US and in India. And so I want to evoke another moment. And I was actually myself present at the NGO forum in connection with the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances that took place in Durban in 2001. The call to include the various multiple forms of oppression associated with the treatment of Dalit communities in India was greeted with solidarity by many groups, especially feminist identified women of color from the US. But others were influenced by the position of the Indian government at that time, which responded by insisting that caste should not be included in the conversations that were unfolding in Durban because caste was an internal matter within India. Kind of reminds me of the arguments that were made by various governors in the southern states during the period of segregation. George Wallace, for example, who was the governor of Alabama, who claimed states' rights, and in the process called for segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. But very interesting conversations began to unfold. And this historical moment of contact, like the call for solidarities among indigenous groups worldwide and other issues that were placed on the historical agenda at that gathering, unfortunately, many of them were overshadowed by the September 11th attacks, which occurred in the immediate aftermath of the conference and forum. Nevertheless, by this time, we see important new developments with respect to feminist activism and scholarship that emphasize engagements with difference, that attempt to create conversations that do not render these differences invisible. Therefore, by the time Dalit women activists conduct a tour of North America, where I had the privilege to meet them at the 15th Color of Violence conference organized by an organization which is called Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. By that time, anti-racist feminists in the US and anti-caste feminists in India had already begun, respectively, to radically transform the terrain on which demands for social justice unfold. And of course, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the All India Dalit Women's March that took place when activists marched across this country to point out the failure of the Indian government to address issues of violence against Dalit women and their families. And they took this march to North America, pointing out, and I'm quoting, "Our goal is to break the silence on caste apartheid and caste rape, while also standing shoulder to shoulder with other women breaking the silence on state violence all across the US." What we have witnessed during the last period, I think, is the emergence of feminist activists in both of our countries, feminist activists who are anti-capitalist, anti-racist, who have been able to more effectively link misogyny and casteism on the one hand and misogyny and racism on the other. The importance of thinking together the state violence that undergirds and reproduces casteism with sexual violence that is often assumed to be unrelated to the structures of casteism. This cannot be underestimated. This is precisely the argument that the late feminist sociologist Sharmila Regge makes when she calls for what she calls, when she argues for what she calls a Dalit women's standpoint. And incidentally, I had the privilege of meeting Sharmila Regge 5 years ago when she invited me to visit the Savitribai Phule Women's Studies Center at Pune University, where she brought together a remarkable group of scholars and activists. Feminist approaches influenced by efforts within social justice activism to bring together phenomena, ideas, categories, stories that have always been treated and conceptualized as separate from one another, have provided a radical impetus against casteism on the one hand and racism on the other. And I'd like to say that I'm very sorry that Sharmila Regge's life was cut short. In this respect, she died very young, as did Anuradha Gandhi. as Mary John and others pointed out in their tribute to her, sociologist, feminist scholar, writer, and activist Sharmila Regge was successful in bringing the structural violence of caste and its linkages with sexuality and labor into the feminist discourse. And those of us in the US who have long attempted to argue that one cannot think class separately from race and gender and sexuality, just as one cannot think race separately from class and gender and sexuality. And it is this focus on what is often referred to as intersectionality. This is the word we all recognize today, although I might argue that these conjunctures are often more complicated than simple intersections. I spoke at the Tata Institute for the Social Sciences in a dialogue with Gina Dent. It seems as if that happened years ago, but it was just 2 days ago, I believe. And we spoke together about abolition feminism. And I evoked the feminist sociologist Beth Ritchie in that conversation. Beth Ritchie, who writes against mainstream carceral feminism and argues in her book, Arrested Justice, Black Women Violence and the Prisonation, for recognizing the linkages between racist state violence and sexual violence that appears to unfold at the level of the individual, is a scholar who comes to mind when I think about the work of Sharmila Regge. And I evoke Beth Ritchie once more because I'm so sorry that we never managed to bring her into conversation with Sharmila Regge, two feminist scholar activists who worked in their respective countries on the circuits that connect state violence and sexual violence. Although this conversation unfortunately did not happen, as I previously mentioned, representatives of the All India Dalit Women's Rights Forum had a powerful impact on the Insight Conference, which took place in 2015, of which Beth Ritchie is a major leader. And that was another one of those productive moments of contact. Insight is an organization, according to its own self-description, which is a nationwide network of radical feminists of color working to end violence against women, gender nonconforming, and trans people of color in our communities. Insight brings together scholars, organizers, advocates, activists in a range of social justice struggles, and they emphasize the need for critical dialogue across the usual boundaries. In the most recent phase of radical anti-racist activism, Black Lives Matter has emerged as a sign of militancy at a time when a post-racial era was proclaimed in conjunction with the election of Barack Obama 8 years ago. And as the most recent presidential elections in the US presage a new, more conservative, more restrictive political phase with Donald Trump as the head of state, and even as I say this, I cannot believe what I'm saying. But given this new political phase, we will no doubt be relying on the Black Lives Matter movement and other radical activist formations, the climate movement, for example, to mount contestations and protests that are meant to remind the world that we are not about to accept the future that Trump has described in the platforms that accompanied his candidacy. But I want to try to narrate this most recent phase of the Black movement. And I would begin by referring to the response to the killing of Trayvon Martin. And you saw in the first film an allusion to the killing of Trayvon Martin and the failure to hold George Zimmerman accountable for his death. So I would refer to the response to that event and the creation of an organization called Dream Defenders in the state of Florida. And of course, this new surge of activism is accelerated 2 years later by the protests in relation to the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. As the protests against Trayvon Martin unfolded, 3 Black women activists, and their names were also included in the opening film, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrice Cullors. The 3 of them created the hashtag Black Lives Matter. When the protest in response to the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson began to unfold, and it was clear that this was a new protracted phenomenon, the 3 of them began to create a membership network under the sign of Black Lives Matter. And today, of course, Black Lives Matter is a hashtag. It remains a hashtag. It is also a network, a membership network, but it's a larger movement as well. And in fact, the movement for Black Lives, MBL, encompasses more than 50 organizations all over the US and Canada. Of course, there have been numerous efforts to dispute the efficacy of the slogan Black Lives Matter by those who argue that a more democratic expression would be all lives matter. And I can't resist the temptation to mention that this was one of the controversies around the candidacy of Hillary Clinton, who had to learn that the call for Black Lives Matter was not a call that excluded others. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the website of Black Lives Matter, you'll see Black Lives Matter, Black Women Matter, Black Girls Matter, Black Gay Lives Matter, Black Bi Lives Matter, Black Boys Matter, Black Queer Lives Matter, Black Men Matter, Black Lesbians Matter, Black Trans Lives Matter, Black Immigrants Matter, Black Incarcerated Lives Matter, Black Differently Abled Lives Matter. Yes, Black Lives Matter. And when Black Lives Matter, that means also that Latino, Asian American, Native American, Muslim, poor, and working class people's, white people's lives matter as well. So it's a way of moving toward a universal proclamation that does not render indivisible, or that does not render invisible all of the specifics and particularities that characterize all Black lives. But I would say that although the leadership of the Black Lives Matter is overwhelmingly Black women, including Black queer women throughout the country, it has thus been a major challenge. It has nonetheless been a major challenge to force a recognition of the degree to which women are the targets of state violence, directly or indirectly. And of course, it is absolutely important that after decades and decades of being the primary organizers of social justice movements, and I think that's probably pretty much the case everywhere, that women do the organizing work. But they are not recognized as leaders. And so, finally we see a situation where women are being recognized as the leaders. But then various veterans, civil rights veterans and public figures have asked of this movement, where are the leaders? Because it appears to be a leaderless movement. And the response has been, we are not a leaderless movement, we are a leaderful movement. And the movement announces that we do not now need the traditional, recognizable, Black, male, charismatic leader. Which isn't to say that we don't love Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and we don't deeply appreciate their historical contributions, but there is no need to replicate the past. And besides, this is the 21st century, and by now we should have learned that leadership should not be a male prerogative. And since women have always done the work of organizing these movements, so women should be in the leadership. And within the Black movement, we've engaged in these struggles around gender from the very beginning of the 20th century, and especially in the 1960s and 1970s. But finally, we do see a movement that values radical Black women, that values radical Black queer women. And we say that when Black women stand up, as they did during previous eras, during, for example, the Montgomery bus boycott, they were the organizers and the backbone of the boycott, which is what launched the movement we know as the civil rights movement. When they stand up, earth-shaking changes happen. But as historian Barbara Ransby has emphasized, we cannot romanticize leaderlessness. Those who romanticize the concept of leaderless movements often misuse the words of Ella Baker, who said, "Strong people don't need a strong leader." And Baker developed this message in various iterations over her 50-year career working in the trenches of racial justice struggles. But what she meant was very specific and contextual. She was calling for people to disinvest from the notion of the messianic, charismatic leader who promises political salvation in exchange for deference. And as Ransby also points out, Baker also did not mean that movements would naturally emerge without collective analysis, without serious strategizing, without organizing, without mobilizing, and without consensus building. And so new organizations such as Black Lives Matter and in the US, Dream Defenders and Black Youth Project 100, We Charge Genocide. These are just a few of the new generation organizations that have developed new models of leadership that acknowledge how important Black feminist insights are to the development of viable 21st century radical movements. These movements recognize that as we were asked to say his name, the names of those who have been killed by the police, that we should also be able to say her name and their name as well. They recognize that those who counter the slogan Black Lives Matter with what they assume is a more all-embracing, all lives matter, are often embracing a strategy that glosses over the particular reasons why it is important to insist quite specifically on an end to racist violence. Similarly, there have been many calls for an end to caste violence, and indeed, as Ambedkar put it, for the annihilation of caste. But it is quite interesting that here in India, and I hope I'm not making the same mistake that Dr. King made in 1959, when I say that the links between casteism and patriarchy, which Ambedkar made, and which Phule before him made, that these links have been more emphatically insisted upon. In the US, it seems that we struggle time and time again to link patriarchy and class and racism. And we discover that women so easily fall out of the frame when we speak about such issues as the violence of over-incarceration and the violence of police surveillance. And even as women are in the leadership of the struggle, we have a hard time creating persuasive arguments for the popular recognition that women are also deeply injured by racist violence, especially in the context of connections with class and with heteropatriarchy. And perhaps in this respect, we might learn something from our Dalit sisters about the importance of linking patriarchy and sexual violence. But let me say before I conclude that as these movements in the US had begun to unfold, we were all quite shocked by the consequence of the last election. Because just as we had grown comfortable with the idea of having a president, as critical as we may have been of his policies, but at least we had a president who garnered respect in the world for his intelligence and seriousness. And this came after 8 years of, do you remember George W. Bush? And now we have a president-elect who, sad to say, causes us to think much better of Bush. Who would have ever thought that was possible? But of course, this election followed 2 terms of the first black president in the history of the U.S. I mean, it's so interesting that that term has been repeatedly used as if we will have the second and third and fourth and fifth. But yes, it was a major shock. But as I reflected on our responses to this election, and some of you may know that people were weeping in the streets when Trump was elected. It was as if we were experiencing the end of the world. Despite the fact that we've also witnessed the emergence of new and vibrant youth movements over the last period. And I reflected on our response to the election of Nixon in 1968, right? And I didn't remember it feeling like the end of the world. Of course, it was terrible that Nixon was elected, but I don't think that we imagined our political expression to be confined by electoral process, the whole electoral process, and so there was promise elsewhere. There was promise in the solidarity that we experienced with people who were struggling for liberation in Africa, in Latin America. There was the Cuban Revolution. There were those in Vietnam who were in the process of defeating, later on, the US invasion. And so it seems that this discussion about solidarities that bring us together across national borders is one that is even more important given the consequences of the last election. And so what do? I think that we continue to build and rebuild and consolidate community, and we recognize that we will have to struggle over the coming period as we have never struggled before. After all, freedom is a constant struggle. Thank you very much.
May I invite Elena to please come up here. She will speak to us. She'll translate this to Hindi, after which we will open up to the panel for questions.
मेरे लिए एंजेला ने जो भी कहा उसका अनुवाद करना कठिन है, क्योंकि एंजेला ने इतने सारे अलग अलग आयाम छुआ उसने, लेकिन फिर भी मैं कोशिश करती हूँ संक्षेप में बताने का। एक तो एंजेला ने शुरुआत में कमेटी को, अनुराधा के स्मृति के लिए जो समिति बनी है उसके सदस्यों को सबको धन्यवाद दिया, और बहुत सारे लोगों ने जिन्होंने यहाँ उनको लाने में मदद की। और शुरुआत में उन्होंने अलग अलग जो समय जहाँ पे यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स में नस्लवाद का मुद्दा और भारत में जातिवाद का मुद्दा, जहाँ जहाँ ये आपस में संपर्क में आए, और शुरुआत से उन्होंने दिखाने की कोशिश की कि एक तरीके का संपर्क और एक रूपता, एकजुटता, दोनों जो आंदोलन थे उनमें कहीं ना कहीं थी। सबसे पहले वो कहती हैं कि जब ज्योतिबा फुले ने अपना लेखन कार्य शुरू किया और उनके पहली पुस्तक में उन्होंने उसको समर्पित किया, पुस्तक को यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स में जो दास्ता के खिलाफ जो आंदोलनकारी थे उनके याद में। और इसी तरीके से ज्योतिबा फुले के बाद उन्होंने फिर बाबा साहेब अम्बेडकर की भी बात की कि अम्बेडकर जब कोलंबिया विश्वविद्यालय में पढ़ने गए थे, एक तो विश्वविद्यालय की स्थिति ऐसी थी कि वो हार्लेम नाम की जगह न्यूयॉर्क शहर में, जो कि अश्वेत अमेरिका का राष्ट्रीय राजधानी के रूप में जाना जाता था, वहाँ पे स्थित था। और उन्होंने W.E.B. डू बॉयस के साथ उन्होंने संपर्क किया और उन्होंने अमेरिका में अश्वेतों की समस्या, जिसको नीग्रो समस्या उस समय लोग कहते थे, उसके बारे में जानने की इच्छा व्यक्त की। और उन्होंने भी लिखा कि वापस लिखा और दोनों में एक पत्राचार का संबंध स्थापित हुआ और उन्होंने भारत में जातिवाद की समस्या और US में नस्लवाद की समस्या पे काफ़ी गंभीर आपस में चर्चा की। लेकिन अमेरिका में लोग सबसे ज़्यादा अगर it's okay, I'll manage. It's a short. आगे सबसे ज़्यादा अगर लोग जानते हैं भारत के बारे में और भारत में जातिवाद की समस्या के बारे में, वो मार्टिन लूथर किंग के लेखन से और उन्होंने जो कुछ बोला उसके तहत है। मार्टिन लूथर किंग आए थे इस देश में और उन्होंने एक किताब लिखी कि गांधी के देश में, जिसमें उन्होंने एक बड़ा रुचिकर मंतव्य रखा, जो कि बाद में कई लोगों को लगा कि ये सही आंकलन नहीं था समस्या का। उन्होंने ये कहा कि भारत में जो पूरा नेतृत्व है, राजनीतिक नेतृत्व, वो जातिवाद को समाप्त करने पे समर्पित है और वो चाहता है कि वो समाप्त हो जाए और उसके लिए काम कर रहा, जो कि शायद एक गलती थी, क्योंकि उन्होंने ये अपना जो आंदोलन उन्होंने लीड किया, जिसकी नेतृत्व प्रदान किया, उस आंदोलन में कानूनी बदलाव पे जो जोर था, लीगल चेंज पे, कहीं ना कहीं भारत के अनुभव से उन्होंने इस स्ट्रैटेजी पे, इस रास्ते पे को उन्होंने अपनाया और शायद उनके अपने जीवन में और अपने संघर्ष में वो जिस तरीके से एक कानूनी लड़ाई, सिविल राइट्स की, नागरिक अधिकारों की लड़ाई के ऊपर उन्होंने बहुत ज़्यादा ध्यान दिया, शायद भारत से सीख, जो भी उनको सीख मिली उसके तहत ये हुआ। लेकिन ये जातिवाद का मुद्दा, नस्लवाद का मुद्दा, ये कानूनी बदलाव से काफ़ी मतलब और ज़्यादा जटिल मसला है। और यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स में जब संघर्ष आगे चलता रहा, काफ़ी शीघ्र ही ये समझ में आया कि इसके लिए और काफ़ी एक अन्य तरह से भी प्रयास करने की ज़रूरत है। फिर आगे उन्होंने दलित पैंथर का जो जन्म, जो कि 1972 में महाराष्ट्र में हुआ, 6 साल पहले ब्लैक पैंथर संगठन का वहाँ पे उदय हुआ था और दलित पैंथरों ने उससे एक काफ़ी कुछ सीखा और उनके काफ़ी रणनीति को अपनाया और उसके तहत काम करना शुरू किए। तो ये एक और क्षण था जहाँ पे दोनों आंदोलन, नस्लवाद के खिलाफ आंदोलन और जातिवाद के खिलाफ आंदोलन, वो एक दूसरे के करीब आए। इस तरीके से एंजेला ने कई ऐसे समय और कई ऐसे क्षण को चिन्हित किया जहाँ पे दोनों आंदोलन एक दूसरे के करीब आए और कहीं ना कहीं एक दूसरा से सीखा, एक दूसरे के संपर्क में आए और साथ में काम किया। एक और समय का वो बताती हैं जिस समय ऑल इंडिया दलित विमेंस मार्च 2001 में, जब दलित महिलाओं का संगठन ने मतलब एक मार्च उन्होंने संगठित किया और एक बड़ा मोर्चा, फिर वो यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स में भी गए और वहाँ पे उन्होंने इनसाइट संगठन के जो सदस्य हैं उनके साथ उन्होंने संपर्क किया और धीरे धीरे एक नारीवादी आवाज़, स्त्री संगठनों की आवाज़ भी इस विमर्श में प्रवेश किया और उसने इस पूरे जो दोनों आंदोलन है, दोनों आंदोलनों को भी और ज़्यादा सशक्त बनाया और उसमें बहुत सारे नए आयाम, संगठन बनाने के नए तरीके, इन चीज़ों को उन्होंने शामिल किया, जिसके तहत आज जो दोनों आंदोलन में एक रूपता दिखती है और दोनों आंदोलन में जो ताकत है वो कहीं ना कहीं औरतों के हस्तक्षेप से आंदोलन को मिला है। और आगे फिर उन्होंने डरबन का जो सम्मेलन था जहाँ पे एंजेला खुद भी गई हुई थी उसका जिक्र किया और वहाँ पे एक जो बड़ा रोचक मुद्दा उन्होंने बताया कि भारत का जो सरकारी डेलीगेशन था डरबन कॉन्फ्रेंस में, उन्होंने वहाँ पे अपना मत ये रखा कि जातिवाद की बात, भारत में जातिवाद की बात उस सम्मेलन में नहीं उठाया जाना चाहिए क्योंकि सम्मेलन नस्लवाद के खिलाफ था। इट वॉज अ कॉन्फ्रेंस अबाउट रेस इश्यूज़ और वहाँ पे इसलिए नहीं उठाया जाना चाहिए क्योंकि ये हमारा अंदरूनी मामला है, हमारा इंटरनल इशू है जो कि हम अपने देश में कहीं ना कहीं हल कर लेंगे। लेकिन इसका तो आप जानते हैं कि सभी ने फिर विरोध भी किया और ये मुद्दा उठा। लेकिन ये प्राइवेट इशू और पब्लिक इशू का जो डिबेट है, ये जब औरतें जब बड़ी संख्या में आंदोलन में शामिल हुई दोनों जगह पे, ये मामला पब्लिक और प्राइवेट का जो विभाजन है उसको तोड़ने का और ज़्यादा तेज़ी से बढ़ा। औरतें जैसे जैसे आंदोलन में आई, जातिवाद के खिलाफ भी, नस्लवाद के खिलाफ भी बहुत सारे नए आयाम इसमें शामिल हुए। दोनों आंदोलन स्ट्रॉन्ग हुए, मजबूत हुए। औरतों ने हमेशा से ही संगठन बनाने का, संगठन को मजबूत करने का, संगठन खड़ा करने का काम किया है, लेकिन आंदोलन के नेतृत्व में वो बहुत कम सामने उस तरीके से आ पाई हैं। और क्या, That's it, I guess. आगे फिर उन्होंने ब्लैक लाइव्स मैटर संगठन की बात की। ब्लैक लाइव्स मैटर जो अभी ट्रेवर मार्टिन के जो असैसिनेशन, जो हत्या हुई और जिमरमैन जिस तरीके से छूट गए सारे आरोपों से, उस एक अन्यायपूर्ण घटना के खिलाफ वो संगठन बना। वो संगठन एक शायद पहला ऐसा संगठन था जहाँ पे एक पुरुष नेतृत्व की भूमिका में नहीं थे, एक वन काइंड ऑफ रिकग्नाइज्ड मेल लीडरशिप उसका अभाव था। किसी ने कहा एक बार कि इस संगठन का नेता कौन है और ये नेता विहीन संगठन है क्या, और उसका जवाब संगठन से ये आया कि नेता विहीन नहीं है, इसमें नेता से भरपूर संगठन है, बहुत सारे लोग जो है वो लीडरशिप में है। इसी तरीके से शर्मिला रेगे की भी उन्होंने बात की, शर्मिला की याद की। और शर्मिला जब पिछले बार वो इस देश में आई थी तब शर्मिला ने उनको इनवाइट किया था पुणे में क्रांति ज्योति सावित्रीबाई फुले महिला अध्ययन केंद्र में बोलने के लिए, और वहाँ वो गई थी। शर्मिला ने जिस तरीके से वहाँ एक महिलाओं का मुद्दा और ख़ास करके औरतों का मुद्दा, औरतों के खिलाफ हिंसा का मुद्दा, जातिवाद का मुद्दा, और जहाँ पे सेक्सुअल वायलेंस, यौन शोषण, महिलाओं के शरीरों के ऊपर महिलाओं के शरीर का इस्तेमाल, उसके खिलाफ हिंसा और राजसत्ता का हिंसा, ये सारी चीज़ें किस तरीके से जुड़ती हैं, इस पे उन्होंने जो विमर्श तैयार किया और उनके इंस्टीट्यूशन में जिस तरीके के काम हुए वो अपने आप में एक बहुत ही प्रभावशाली काम है और एक नई दिशा शायद आंदोलन के लिए भी कहीं ना कहीं उसका प्रतीक है, उसको एक विमर्श में लाने में भी मदद करती है। इसी तरीके से यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स में बेथ रिची के काम भी इसी प्रकार का है। शायद इन दोनों की कभी मुलाकात नहीं हुई थी, लेकिन दोनों के कामों में बहुत सारी समानता थी। और आगे आज के राजनीतिक परिदृश्य में ये सारी बातें, हमारी जो एकरूपता, हमारे आंदोलन का साथ आना, इन सारी चीज़ों को याद करना बहुत ज़रूरी है, क्योंकि आज के समय की जो राजनीतिक परिदृश्य है जहाँ पे यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स को वो याद करती हैं कि जो राष्ट्रपति के रूप में जिसका निर्वाचन हुआ ट्रंप का, और ये विश्वास करना कठिन है कि कैसे ये हुआ। जब इलेक्शन के रिज़ल्ट आए लोग सड़कों पे रो रहे थे, लेकिन ऐसे समय में हम और ज़्यादा याद करने को मजबूर हो जाते हैं कि हमारा संघर्षों में समानता, संघर्षों में एक दूसरे का हाथ पकड़ना, एक दूसरे को मजबूत करना कितना ज़रूरी है, क्योंकि आज़ादी का संघर्ष, जो मानवता का संघर्ष है, उसका अंत तभी होगा जब हम सब एक दूसरे के साथ आएंगे और मिलकर दुनिया में एक न्यायपूर्ण समाज बनाने के लिए हम संघर्ष करेंगे, जैसे कि वियतनाम की लड़ाई के समय में और ऐतिहासिक रूप से कई बार पूरे दुनिया के जनता ने दिखाया है। उसी रास्ते में हमारे लिए आशा का किरण है। थैंक यू।
Why do you think, or is it true in the first place, that large number of the working class and the poor, even in East and West Coast as well as in Middle America, parts of America, voted for Trump? What must be the reason why people, I'm not saying or even suggesting that they should have voted Hillary for whatever reasons, but why should they actually vote for Donald Trump? That question I thought needed to be discussed, because those people who voted for Trump belong to our fraternity, part of our struggling masses.
Well, you know, actually, only 25% of the eligible voters voted for Trump. So that's a relatively small minority. It is true that some working class white people and maybe a few people of color voted for Trump. But I think that the reason they turned to Trump had to do largely with the failure of the Democratic Party, to represent their particular plight as a plight that has been produced by global capitalism. And ironically, Trump, who has made his fortune precisely as a result of capitalism, became the person who appealed to them demagogically, because he was able to point to Muslims, he was able to point to immigrants, other people of color as the scapegoats for their predicament. So it's a complicated question, because I think it points to the failure of the left, the failure of the labor movement. And you know, that is why those people, as small a number as they were, but I do think it's really important to recognize that almost half of all of the eligible voters didn't even go to the polls. And of those, the vast majority would never have voted for Trump. So the election was evidence of the bankruptcy of the political system in the US, the failure of either major party to respond to the needs of people.
Well, actually, it's a journey from imperialism of the earlier kind, and followed by Nixon-Kissinger team's villainy in international politics, recently ending up with Tea Party and finally leading to Trump. But it appears that slowly but steadily, it is the right which is winning, not only in US, but India, most of Europe, including France now. And why do you think such a sudden rise of right, when all of us thought in the 60s and 70s that they will not be able to rise and rule again? I mean, one can understand the setback, but it is spreading like a virus, the right-wing virus. What could be the analysis of this new globalization of the right?
Well, in my talk, I tried to gesture towards the importance of developing a feminist analysis that would assist those of us who still agree that Marxism is of value during this era, but it must be a Marxism that is inflected by analyses that are rooted in feminism. So, having said that, I would also point out that given the transformation of the global working class and given the feminization of the global working class, we have to account for the fact that the working class no longer looks like it looked in the past. And therefore, labor movements have to address very different populations when one considers that women and girls are the primary workers in the manufacturing sector all over the world. So that the future really will be contingent on the ability of the labor movement to shift and change and recognize that if we believe in organizing the unorganized, that it is women who need to be organized during this era. And if we aren't able to make these shifts, then it will be quite easy for demagogues such as Trump to argue that the reason why certain groups of people find themselves in difficult situations has to do with immigrants, has to do with with Muslims and the effort to point to the so-called war on terror as the way in which to defend democracy in the current era. So yeah, we have to rethink the ways in which we imagine the radical struggle. The left has to completely shift. This is what I think. I don't know.
I think, Mr. J, you want to ask?
Angela, 1972, Black Panthers, Dalit Panthers. 2016, Black Lives Matter, Dalit Lives Matter. But I think I want to actually get to, while there are similarities, when you look at caste and race, I think there are also some essential differences. And to my mind, just two, I'd like you to respond to this. I'd like to just list two essential differences, I think. One is the race problem in the US, as you would rightly concede, I think, is the direct outgrowth of capitalist exploitation. Capitalist exploitation in the sense the recruitment of labor power to exploit the natural resources of America. So the race problem in the US is the direct outgrowth of capitalist exploitation. Whereas actually in India, the caste system really goes back to almost prehistoric times. And originating in an occupational division of labor and all that. I didn't get into this. This is one essential difference, and it's hell of a difference, actually. The second one, to my mind, is that actually the caste system, has played a function, the functional role of the caste system. If you look at it from the point of view of the exploiting classes, the functional role of it has been to stabilize and rigidify the structure of the society. That is what has happened. Whereas I think when you look at race, you know, race in America, correct me if I'm wrong actually, it has always posed a profound threat to the status quo. A profound threat to the status quo in America.
Well, it would be interesting to engage in a conversation about the similarities and differences of race and caste. I was actually focusing in my talk on the challenges, you know, not so much on the actual effort to define the differences between the two. But I would argue that one cannot always explain a phenomenon by looking at its origin, because history makes a difference. And certainly racism in the US today is not the same racism as existed during the era of slavery. And I would assume that casteism is not the same today, you know, as it was thousands of years ago. And you know, certainly given, when one thinks about the extent to which colonialism had an impact on the way caste functions in India, and certainly the various vagaries of capitalism. If I were to talk about the way in which racism has shifted over the recent period, and particularly as a consequence of the impact of global capitalism, I would speak about the structures of racism within a range of institutions, and the activist work that I've done now for, I don't know, 30, 40 years has been related to the prison system. And to see what we now call the prison industrial complex as connected to the era of global capitalism beginning in the 1980s, and the development of a ever expanding prison system precisely to contain those who found it no longer possible to find jobs, with the dismantling of the welfare state no longer possible to find health care or education and so forth. And so one could argue that this relatively new formation, the prison industrial complex, is one of the primary examples of the structure of racism in the 21st century, linked, of course, to histories of slavery, but very different from the way racism functioned in that era. So that is what I would say with respect to the changes that have happened in the ways in which racism operates. And one perhaps very important development is the attack on Muslims, the way in which Islamophobia has transformed the terrain of racism. And of course, Islamophobia is not the same as the racism directed against people of African descent, but it has had an impact on the way racism in a general way expresses itself. And one example I would give is the militarization of the police. We hear about all of these attacks on black people by the police. Many of these police departments, as was evidenced during the Ferguson uprisings, have been entirely militarized. That is to say, they have military weaponry, military strategies. They look more like soldiers than they look like police. And we, of course, discovered that many of these small police departments that have been trained by Israel in counterinsurgency tactics. So this is, I mean, this is the way in which, one of the examples of the ways in which what we call structural racism transforms. And I would ask you to perhaps narrate some ways in which caste has changed as a consequence of the historical developments.
I will not raise question on the provoking your lecture. Dalit Panther and Black Panther. These are the two important fighting organizations of 20th century. They were fighting against the establishment, against the government, but their fighting period is more or limited to 4 to 5 years, or up to 6 years. Black Panther, started fighting in 1966, but the real fighting was up to 1970. Dalit Panther started fighting against the establishment in 1972, but the real fighting was up to 75-76. So both the organizations, fighting period, real fighting period I'm telling you, like that today also some Dalit Panther movements is in Maharashtra, that is not important, but the real fighting, like a Black Panther, like a Dalit Panther, their period is less than 5 to 6 years. So what I know, many of the people, they are witnessed the Dalit Panther, they know the reason, what is the reason of this fighting period. I want to know from you, being the leader of Black Panther, why so less period was for Black Panther, real movement, real struggle of the Black Panther.
Well, the Black Panther Party was founded in 1966. As a matter of fact, the Black Panther Party recently observed its 50th anniversary. It was founded in the city of Oakland, California. It was a response to precisely the same kind of racist police violence that we have now again become aware of. I say again become aware of because this violence has been unfolding all along for decades since one might argue the immediate aftermath of slavery. And Huey Newton and Bobby Seale decided to intervene in what was referred to as the occupation of the police occupation of the black community. And so they each brought weapons, guns, and law books. And at that time, it was legal to carry weapons, as long as the weapons weren't concealed. And I should say, incidentally, that in some states now, it is legal to carry concealed weapons. In some states, in Texas, for example, it is now legal to carry a concealed weapon on the various university campuses. But I say that parenthetically. And so their argument was that, that they should inform people who were being stopped by the police of their rights. So the law book, in a sense, was the symbol of their effort to inform people of their rights. And the guns were symbols of the determination to resist. This happened in 1966. And then, of course, because of the emergence of the Black Panther Party, people all over the country were drawn into this movement. I myself was studying in Europe, And that was one of the primary reasons I decided to return to the US, because it was very clear that there was a shift in the Black liberation movement and that very important things were about to happen. Now, having said this, I should point out that many people are under the impression that I was a leader of the Black Panther Party. I was not a leader of the Black Panther Party. I was a member of the Black Panther Party, and I was a member of the Communist Party as well. And at one point, all of the people who were members of other parties were asked to choose. And I actually chose the Communist Party. I chose the Communist Party because I felt that at that time, even though we had not yet developed the language that allowed us to talk about intersectionality, I felt that it was really important to link the struggle for Black liberation to resistance to capitalism, and which the Panthers did, but in a different way. I think what you are referring to as the perhaps the most visible phase of the Black Panther Party was the repression. By the police, by the FBI. The FBI declared that the Black Panther Party was the greatest threat to the internal security of the US. And police departments all over the country, as a result of having been instructed by the FBI, by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, began to attack the Black Panther parties. And then, of course, you see the emergence of many political prisoners. Huey Newton went to prison. Bobby Seale was arrested. Erica Huggins was arrested. There are people like Eddie Conway, who was just released. Members of the Black Panther Party who've just been released after over 40 years of imprisonment. And as a matter of fact, there are still a number of people behind bars who have been in prison since the early 1970s. And so that was the era that gave the Black Panther Party the most visibility, but it was also the era of repression. And it was also responsible ultimately for the demise of the Black Panther Party. So I hope I, answered your question.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, everybody, for your questions. Angela, I've often heard you talk about how some of the most valuable, maybe the most valuable contribution of feminism has been methodological, has been that it has taught us a way of asking questions, a way of making connections between seemingly disparate things sometimes, and how important that is in terms of both understanding in the broadest and most concrete ways the challenges that we face in our own localized spaces as well as transnationally, right? And that those connections and the way of asking questions, in fact, is crucial if we want to create deeper solidarities and networks of struggle across. So I'm going back now to, and we saw a lot of this on we went on this delegation, the Women of Color and Indigenous Women's Delegation to Palestine in 2011. And I think that, and which Gina Dent was also on, I think one of the most important learnings of that was really what it taught us as a very diverse group, right, of women of color from the US and women from the global South, what it taught us about what Palestinian feminists and women and their comrades were doing when they were making solidarities and links among different ways of organizing in Palestine, and then how we saw the similarities between that, what it taught us, I think, about questions of occupation, of racism, incarceration, etc. So I think that what I maybe want to ask is, what do you think are the new questions that feminists and our comrades need to ask now, right, given the hyper-militarized, capitalist, and fundamentalist right-wing shifts, I'm going back to your first question, right, of power in state power across the world, right? So we have India, US, Philippines, France, UK. What connections do we need to think through in order to strategize now across these spaces? But what questions does feminism or feminist methodologies, the kind of real sharp focus on questions of gender and sexual violence and connections to state violence, etc. What kind of questions do you think we need to think about? So it carries on the question about how do we make these solidarities and alliances, and another way of saying is how does the left actually need to change?
Well, I think if we had the answer to those questions, we would probably not be in the current predicament. But I do think it is important to raise questions about the role of the state. And feminists' interrogations of the state do not exclude such issues as sexual violence. I think we were speaking 2 days ago at the event at the Tata Institute for the Social Sciences about sexual violence and the state. And about the way in which we can actually argue that the state is directly a perpetrator of sexual violence. We were talking about the routine ways in which women prisoners are treated all over the world, the strip searches that happen every day, the cavity searches that happen routinely, and the way in which these routines are often assumed bureaucratically simply to be a part of the way in which prisons function. But then, if we speak about, and this is an insight that has come from women prisoners themselves, and I think this is another feminist insight, that knowledge gets produced in many different sites, and that, as a matter of fact, the connections that women prisoners have made between the sexual assault that they have experienced in relationships or in individual settings and the sexual assault they experience in prison links or allows us to define the state as a perpetrator of sexual assault. And so where does this take us? This means that we can no longer assume that sexual violence is simply, something that happens because of individual proclivities toward misogyny or whatever. It means that if we are interested in eradicating sexual violence, we can no longer assume that we simply send the perpetrators to prison. That we have to begin to deeply question the role of the state. And I say this because I'm always a person who believes in imagining that which we really want, even though we know we're probably not going to get it now. Because if we don't talk about what we want, we will forget. And so what might it mean to no longer have to consider the state as the most appropriate form of human community? How can we think beyond the state? And of course, when we were in Palestine, that was one of the insights there, because people have talked about either the one-state or the two-state solution and so forth, but we discovered that Palestinians were not only opposed to the state of Israel, but they were opposed to the Palestinian Authority. So what did it mean to begin to think outside of the bonds of a necessary state? But I think that feminist methodological approaches, the articulation of those things that often are never brought together, but sometimes the pulling apart of things that exist. I think Gina was talking about the ways in which crime and punishment are always thought together. So what does it mean once we pull crime and punishment apart and think about punishment as being connected to so many other things, including racism? So yeah, I don't know. I don't have specific answers, but I do think that transnational solidarities, as you point out, feminist inflected transnational solidarities are going to be absolutely essential during this era, especially if we are to effectively challenge the juggernaut of global capitalism.
Thanks.
Just a short announcement. We will now open the questions that we've received from the House. Angela, we have over 60 questions. Now, that would be impossible to deal with and take them on. So what our committee members have done back in the stage is they've gone through all the questions that they've received, and they've kind of put them together or categorized them. And if time permit, we will probably deal with about 5 or 6 questions at the most, or maybe 4 to 6 questions at the most, because there are many similarities in these questions. It's not to, just throw out these questions that we've received, but they've painstakingly gone through these questions, they've read through, and they have kind of categorized them. So what I'll do is, I'll invite, Shoma, you doing? Shoma sent to present these questions, and then Angela could take to answer them. Just before that, another small announcement. 2 of Angela's books are now on sale outside, and we plan to have a short session of signing books at the end of this program. Let me repeat, a short one. Please do not come for autographs. Only if you have her books, then we will permit. Then we will permit, if I may say so, to come up to the stage. But you could probably stand here on this side of the stage in a line, and our volunteers will regulate that after the question answer session is over. So now, may I request Shoma to take on.
I'm very sorry that we had to leave out so many questions, but Angela, there were some related to Dalit feminism, and including a question like, why isn't there a Dalit feminist on the panel? But so at the cost of being considered subjective, we are just asking two questions to you about related to the women's movement. To what extent is white alliance or solidarity accepted in the black movement in the US? Does the black movement accept and allow white leadership? And what has been your experience of white people offering solidarity in the black movement? And the other one is about patriarchy or misogyny within Dalit Panthers and the Dalit movement. How have you been able to tackle it, and do you have any suggestions to us how we can deal with patriarchy within the Dalit movement?
Do you want me to answer this now? Okay,
Yeah,
good.
Go
Well, the first question regarding white people's involvement in the movements, in black movements, anti-racist movements. White people have always been involved in black movements, for better or worse. And so I think it's very important to distinguish between those white people who have brought racist presumptions with them and have attempted to usurp leadership of black movements, and those white people who have understood that it is a very important aspect of engaging in the struggle against racism, learning how to respect black leadership. And so I don't know whether I would like to answer the question as if all white people were the same, but rather pointing out that the contribution of anti-racist white people has been extremely important over the years. This is not to say that there haven't also been serious problems of racism. But movements attempt to address those issues as they unfold. And just as it is important to learn how to accept black leadership, it's important to learn how to accept women's leadership. And so to answer the question with respect to patriarchy within the Dalit movement, of course within the Black Panther movement in the US, particularly given the historical moment, so many of the ideas and so many of the strategies were deeply masculinist. We didn't have the vocabulary to recognize that at the time, but now we know that there were many mistakes, there were many problems, but this is what movements do. They make mistakes, and they recognize those mistakes. And one of the things one might say about the Black Panther Party is that the kind of militarist stance was a masculinist stance. And that, as a matter of fact, many of the women in the Black Panther Party had to be better militarists than the men in order to deserve membership. And I mean, I could tell you many stories about the Black Panther Party, including one in which all the women in a particular chapter of the Black Panther Party were expelled like that. And then had to prove their ability to be in this organization. But that was the era, that was the time. We were learning how to address issues of gender. And perhaps if those mistakes had not been made when they were made, we never would have acquired the insights that we have today. So in being critical of the patriarchal stance of the Black Panther Party in the past, I don't in any way mean to undermine the contributions. And this is a feminist approach. It's about using feminist methodology that allows us to recognize that we don't have to choose either one position or the other. We can talk about the huge contributions of the Black Panther Party, and then we can be really deeply critical of that formation. And we can say the same thing of white people who've been involved in the movement, that there have been major problems with respect to racism that expresses itself internally within formations. But we've also learned that racism is not simply out there. It's also inscribed in the emotions and in the ways in which people learn how to relate to others. It's inscribed in the relations and the response to those relations. It's about ideology. And I always like to think about a phrase that I learned from Chandra many years ago when I first read Third World Women and the Politics of Feminism, and the way in which she describes the work of Third World women or women of color as a political project, not as an identitarian project, not one in which a simple expression of identity is that which characterizes the project, but rather it is the political project to which we relate. And I can say that there are Black people I would not want to be involved with, and especially given the extent to which numbers of Black people have become a part of the economic and political hierarchies. So I wouldn't want to make a choice regarding who gets to participate and who doesn't simply based on racial background. It's based on the political project that we embrace.
So now we just have the second set of questions, and we will end with that. There are the two short announcement that I made earlier. There are two books of Angela which are being sold outside. One is Our Prisons Obsolete. That's on sale, meaning in the sense there is a discount sale today, which is being sold at 100 rupees instead of 150 rupees. And the second book is Women, Race and Class, which is being sold at 250 rupees instead of 300 rupees. So those of you who have our books or are buying books, could after the question hour, please make a queue here and we will facilitate the signatures. May I call Stephen to present the second set of questions to you, Angela.
First of all, thanks to all of you who sent questions. We were quite overwhelmed by the response. And many of them were questions which I'm sure Angela would have loved to answer, but they fall outside the purview of today's topic. So we've had to keep them for a later date, maybe another interaction with people. Just a last couple of questions, which I think we also kept out questions that the panel already covered, so as not to make it repetitive. There's a question here on the struggle of the depressed classes, as Baba Sahib would have put it, was not only a struggle for material issues, but also a struggle for dignity more importantly. So how would you see this aspect of dignity in the context also of the Black Lives Matter movement? Slightly different, but I think you can also, I'll go through these questions and then you can decide to answer them together. One question is, what are the methods of resistance against oppression and struggle? Related to that, acknowledging that violence in the everyday life of the marginalized has been so huge, does the road to revolution through violence be a good alternative? And slightly different but related to that, across many struggles we have seen co-optation of the leadership, and those who speak about struggles get co-opted into the mainstream. So how does a newer reading of race and feminism address this issue? Sorry? How does a newer reading of race and feminism, address the issue of co-optation?
Co-option.
Okay, maybe I'll see if I can address the last question first, and then maybe you'll remind me what the other questions were. I don't think that we should be as afraid of co-optation as we often are, because in a sense, when ideas get taken up and issues get taken up in a broader framework, when those within the establishment begin to use the language we have developed, in a sense that recognizes that we've been successful, that we've accomplished what we set out to do. But of course, those in power will never take up the issues in the way we would like, and so we have to always recognize our successes when our ideas are being co-opted, but at the same time we have to learn how to move a step further. So it means that our approach has to be how to radicalize whatever it is that has been co-opted. Let me give you an example. Many of us have been working around prison issues for too long, for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And very recently, as a matter of fact, during the Obama administration, the politicians and others have begun to acknowledge the prison crisis. And now it has become a mainstream issue. Everybody talks about mass incarceration. Obama became the first president ever to visit a prison. Newt Gingrich, who represents the right, has an organization called the Right on Crime. And so, of course, they are all now talking about reforming the prisons. Particularly because it has been acknowledged that the U.S. has more people in prison than any other country in the world. A quarter of the world's imprisoned population, whereas the actual population of the U.S. is only about 5% of the global population. And so there are those who've been involved in the movement who have gotten very upset at the way this is unfolded. My approach has been, I'm glad this is happening because it means that the work that we've been doing has made a difference. But it is not our role to capitulate to the ways in which these issues are now being discussed. That is to say, within a conservative framework, but to argue further. I mean, this is why we use the call for abolition to point out that prisons cannot be reformed. And so it means that we have to learn how to accelerate and do more and continue to do what it is we do in order to try to change people's consciousness and make changes in the world.
So this question about not just a material struggle, but a struggle for dignity.
Yeah, yes, struggles against racism, struggles against patriarchy, struggles against casteism are struggles for dignity. And it is important to recognize the link between these material deprivations and spiritual well-being and sense of self. And this is what has been really exciting about the recent emergence of a new phase of the Black movement, that a sense of dignity has begun to re-emerge, that we did not see 10 years ago. And while one cannot always argue that there are specific strategies and tactics that will allow us to achieve dignity, I think it is always important to keep in mind that our struggles have a material dimension. They also have a spiritual dimension, and I'm very conscious of the resonance of that in that notion in India. But I would say that in the US, precisely as a result of the impact of feminist ideas, the whole notion of mental and spiritual health and self-care has been incorporated now into our movements for social justice. In the past, people were expected to basically kill themselves in order to achieve victories in the fight for justice. And it made little sense to impel people to injure themselves in the process of attempting to injure themselves spiritually, mentally, physically sometimes. Those of us who try to survive on 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night. And so now I think this new emphasis on self-care represents the recognition that dignity must be an important dimension of struggle as well.
So, you know, I'm also thinking about Standing Rock and the struggle of indigenous peoples against the Dakota Access Pipeline that has been going on for a long time. And I'm thinking about the fact that their women are in leadership in a lot of those spaces. And when I think about what it means to talk about dignity, right? I mean, that even visually, if anybody goes online and looks at people standing their ground, yeah, in front of, you know, pushing back against militarized state power and always being true to a certain kind of emotional and psychic and spiritual connection to the land and to the struggle, that I think speaks a lot about the dignity that seems to be at the heart of material struggles, actually. So.
And it also allows us to make the connection with the earth and climate movements. Indigenous people, I think also, particularly if one looks at what is unfolding on the reservation of the Standing Rock Sioux, that that we have to learn that it is not about assimilation. And, this gets back to the question that you were talking about, stability, that the caste system has provided for stability and a sense of structure. And perhaps this is precisely what we don't want, because this has been the source of so much injury. And the way in which indigenous people have argued against integration and assimilation, and instead for something new, for sovereignty, is a message, I think, that we can all learn from.
But she answered that in the film.
Okay, the final question. Methods of resistance and the role of violence. It's so interesting that somehow whenever we talk about resistance, there's this easy slippage. It means violence. And while I have never subscribed to a fundamentalist posture of nonviolence, because I believe in the right to self-defense, and I think that movements have the right to defend their goals. I don't think it is helpful to put violence in the forefront, because it means that we're failing to acknowledge what it is we want to achieve, and what it is we want to achieve through our revolutionary struggles. And I was talking about the Panthers early, the Black Panthers, and the resistance to the police occupation using weapons, and that was very important at the moment. But if I think about it from the perspective of what we have learned during the intervening years, I see that learning from Audre Lorde and her argument that you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, I see that, what the Black Panthers were attempting to do at that time was to police the police, was to use the same methods that the police used against the police. And I don't know whether that works. I really don't know whether that works. So I'm reluctant to argue that a discussion about violence as a form of resistance can replace a discussion about what it is we really want, the world we want to inhabit, how we want to see the world change. And when I think about South Africa and the problems that exist in South Africa today, I'm wondering whether they really had that conversation, whether someone like Cyril Ramaphosa, who was such an amazing militant labor leader, the head of the mine workers, is now a billionaire, the wealthiest man in South Africa. So I'm wondering whether they had the conversation, well, what will we do if we win? What kind of world do we want? How are we going to reorganize our society? And so I think that is so much more important. And when people are able to embrace a collective imagination of what the future should bring, I think that we will all be far more powerful than we might be if each one of us were handed a weapon.
Well, if I were to put this in this whole session in a single sentence, I would say the following: Black liberation is essential to the liberation of all people and impossible without it. Similarly, in India, Dalit liberation is essential to the liberation of all people and impossible without it. On behalf of the Anuradha Ghandy Memorial Committee, I'd like first of all to extend a big thank you to Angela Davis for having come here. It's been a wonderful evening. That's all about solidarity, international solidarity. On behalf of the Anuradha Ghandy Memorial Committee, I'd like to, there are a lot of people really we are indebted to, we need to thank. I need to particularly mention Chandra Talpade Mohanty. I need to mention Gina Dent, J.V. Pawar, Kumar Ketkar, and Satyen Bordoloi, who's always been there for us. He's always been there for us, and he puts it up on YouTube for us. Elena Sen, of course, actually the management of the K C College. In fact, they gave us a huge discount on the hall when they learned that Angela is coming here. And of course, Sunil Shanbag. There are a lot of others, I think. So, cheers to all of you, and thank you very much.
So, for those who can stand in the line here, let me again appeal for donations, your contributions to the Anuradha Ghandy Memorial Committee. So please feel free. Susan Abraham is standing in the foyer to get you.